Chapter 28. Sam and Joe had arrived back at the farm late the night before. They had made sure to take a very long and winding trail so as to throw off any pursuers. While it still wasn't 100% clear that it was Roja's cartel they had encountered in that town, Sam was almost certain now. The last thing they wanted was to unwittingly lead them back to the farm, placing the lives of every man, woman, and child in extreme danger. Julio would burn the entire world to get his hands on Sam and Eric, and he'd think nothing of claiming every life on the farm if it brought him his twin prizes even a second sooner. When they returned to camp, no one but the night sentries on the wall was there to greet them. They'd inquired as to the whereabouts of Jacob, and Sam had informed them that their friend was no more. It was a heart-wrenching moment to watch their faces and spirits break together. Sam had delivered the news of death many times over the years. As a captain on the police force, it often fell on him to contact the families of the officers under his leadership when they fell in the line of duty. It never got any easier, and it was even more heart-wrenching when he had such a personal connection to everyone involved. He and Joe had separated soon after entering the farm. Joe was going to deliver the medical supplies to Dr. Jeffries, and Sam was going to head home. When he'd arrived at the farmhouse, Carolyn was sitting on the porch, waiting for him. She stood from her chair at his approach, running down the steps and throwing herself at her husband, flinging her arms around his neck and burying her face in his chest. "Oh, thank God," she exclaimed, squeezing him with all she had. Sam found the strength to wrap his arms around her waist and hold her tightly, burying his face in her hair and allowing the moment to fill in several holes he carried in his heart. They separated and held one another at arm's length. Carolyn looked up into his eyes with glistening tears. It was a look he knew all too well. It was the look she wore whenever he returned from a brutal operation during his time on the force. It was a look of concern and relief, intermingled into one longing gaze. "Are you all right?" she asked him, as she hugged him close under the moonlight once more. "I don't know," Sam said honestly. He then proceeded to tell her everything that had happened, including their success at finding the supplies, the subsequent attack, and the fact that they had left Jacob screaming and bleeding in the street. Carolyn remained strong throughout the entire story, her face never wavering, as she allowed her husband to unburden himself. He was always amazed at her strength in those moments, when he would have to recount absolute horrors, and she'd just take them in stride with a simple nod, an understanding and compassionate look. The strength of his arms might have been more than that of his wife, but the strength of her heart far exceeded his. "It wasn't your fault," she said, as he finished his tale, and Sam simply hung his head low and stared at the ground in shame. "You weren't there, Care," he said, shaking his head back and forth slowly. "You didn't hear him screaming, begging me for help. I've never felt so helpless in my life." "Hey," she said, taking him by the chin and raising his eyes to meet hers. "You, Samuel Shields, are many things, but helpless is not one of them." "I should have saved him," he said, her words bouncing off of him ineffectually. "There was nothing you could have done," she replied. "You don't know that," he said, pulling away from her and turning his back, taking a few steps away to look up at the night sky. "I know you did everything you could," Carolyn said, coming up behind him and draping her arms over his shoulders and neck to pull him in close. "I know Joe felt there was nothing more that could be done, and while you're a capable man, he's more experienced in these things than you are." "I know," Sam said, "and I've gone over it 1,000,000 times in my head already. But I still think if I had done something different, anything different, then we might all have come back safely. He saved my life, and I let him die." "You can't keep thinking like that," Carolyn said. laying the side of her face against his shoulder blade. After a moment of silence, she asked the question he was dreading. "Was it, Roja?" Sam let out a long exhale. His mind had been wrestling with this question, and he'd realized that the small sliver of doubt that still existed in his mind was coming from his own hopes and wasn't based in reality in any way. "Yeah," he said, giving definitive voice to the threat with no room for doubt. "It definitely was." Carolyn pulled away from him, and he heard her curse under her breath. "Care," he said, turning around to lay a hand on her shoulder. But he had nothing to say to her. He could think of nothing in the wake of this huge revelation. "Why?" she asked, tears now spilling out of her eyes and down her cheeks. "Why can't he just leave us alone? Why can't he just die somewhere in a ditch?" "Because the world isn't fair," Sam replied sadly. "He's going to find us eventually," Carolyn said, and Sam nodded silently. "And when he does, he's not going to stop until he has you and Eric." "There's one way to stop him," Sam said, with grim determination. "Only one." "I'm all for killing that son of a bitch," she replied. "I'd do it myself in a heartbeat if it ever came down to it." "I'm going to make sure it never comes to that," Sam replied. "He'll never be close enough to you again for that to happen." "You have to end it, Sam," she said, "for your own sake and for the sake of our son." "I know," he said. "I have faith in our defenses. If he tries to attack us here, I think we have a good shot." "I hope so," she replied, suddenly looking up at the house. A window on the upper floor was open, and both Sam and Carolyn could see a silhouetted figure standing there, watching and listening to every word they said. "Eric," Sam said, realizing his son now knew about Jacob's death and the full extent of the danger they all faced. Damn it. Sam had wanted to sit his son down and explain all of this to him in the morning. But Eric's inquisitive nature had won out in the end, and he'd gotten his father's unfiltered and emotional accounting of the entire ordeal. Sam walked away from his wife, moving up the porch and into the house. He could hear Carolyn behind him. He limped up the stairs, still favoring his sore leg, and came to the closed door that marked the entrance of his son's room. He knocked, and there was no answer. "Eric, let's talk about all this," Sam said, reaching down to turn the knob when no answer came. It was locked. "Eric, come on. We need to talk about this." The only answer was more silence. His son was clearly sitting in there, stewing in his own thoughts, and Sam felt completely powerless in the face of that. He could protect the young man from a lot of things, but not from his own mind. "Come on, kiddo," Sam said, knocking once more. "Baby, open the door," Carolyn said. And suddenly the sound of Eric's rushed footsteps could be heard from within. The lock clicked, and their son opened the door, stepping out of the darkness of his room in a pair of pajama pants and no shirt. Through the dim moonlight, filtering in through the bedroom window, Sam could vaguely make out the wet streaks of tracing lines down his face. "I'm sorry," Sam said. "I'm sorry you had to hear about this like that." "Jacob?" Eric said, his voice strained with grief and guilt. "Yeah," Sam said. "He's gone. And a lot of that fault lays with me, son." "No," Eric replied. "It's with me. It's all me." "What?" Carolyn asked, taking a step toward Eric with a compassionate hand outstretched to him. But Eric took a step back away from the comforting touch of his mother. Carolyn hesitated and drew her hand back. "Baby, how can you say that? He's out here looking for me because I—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. The death of the Dawn still weighed on his heart and mind. Sam had suspected as much, but had been unable to prove it over the last 6 months. "It's because of me," Sam said, wanting to shoulder the responsibility in full, to give his boy a sense of relief. I'm the one who started all of this. I'm the one who took his eye. It all begins and ends with me, son. It doesn't, Eric insisted, his voice breaking with combined anger and anguish. You keep trying to say I'm not a part of this, Dad, but I am. I made myself a part of it the second I pulled that trigger. So like it or not, we're in this together now, because he's coming for me every bit as much as he's coming for you. Sam was quiet in the face of his son's words. As much as he wanted to deny them, as much as he wanted to protest and lock his son away, where no harm could come to him, there was nothing he could say to dispute this claim. Eric was involved now, and Sam knew Roja would never quit, never relent, until he either achieved his revenge or was put in the ground. As he looked at his teenage son, he remembered the day he'd come into this world, how he'd watched in wide-eyed fascination as the doctor pulled him out into the light, swaddled him in a blanket, and handed him off to his mother. Sam could remember the moment he held his son for the first time. He was so tiny and delicate, so frail, as he looked up at him with big blue eyes, so full of wonder and amazement at each new sight. He made a promise that day, that he'd always be there for that little angel in his arms. He'd always protect the frail, tiny baby from the dangers of the world. But now that baby stood before him as a young man, trained and muscled, fully capable of defending himself. But despite all that, Sam wanted nothing more than to wrap him in a blanket once more and hold on to him with the same intensity he'd felt that cold morning in a New York City hospital. But he couldn't keep holding on like that. He had to let go, had to let this child stand on his own for the first time, independent of him. He couldn't shield him from the outside world forever. Eventually, the child would have to become an adult, and adults had to defend themselves against all threats. But that didn't mean he'd be alone while doing it. You're right, Sam said. And Eric recoiled back as though he'd been struck. You're absolutely right. You're in this now. But you're not in it alone, Eric. You've got to stand on your own 2 feet and protect yourself. I get that. But your old man is going to be standing next to you the entire time. And instead of me protecting you, we're going to face this together, if it ever comes to that. Really? Eric asked him, his eyes wide and filled with hope. Yeah, Sam said. But that doesn't mean we go out searching for a fight. It means we stay here with our people. And if that asshole comes looking for a fight, then we give him one, and we put him down once and for all. Sam glanced over at Carolyn to note a reaction to all of this. To his great relief, she gave him a nod and a gentle smile of approval. He breathed a small sigh of relief over that. All right, Dad, Eric said, nodding and looking his father in the eye. I'll be ready. Chapter 29. It didn't take long for news of Jacob's fate to spread among the farm community. The young man had no family to speak of, but the residents of the farm were his chosen family, and they came together to support one another in their grief and mourn the loss of one of their own. It wasn't just Jacob they were mourning. They'd lost many members of their community in the last week, including the men and women killed in the event that started all of this. There would have to be some kind of community memorial service. But Sam couldn't think about that now, with the knowledge that the cartel was out there, still hunting for him and his family. Over the next few days, Sam and Joe worked to bring the community together to help solidify their defenses. The wall was inspected and reinforced in areas where Joe felt they might be vulnerable. The area outside the wall was mined with a series of landmines Sam had stored away in his weapons shed. The location of the mines were marked on maps and distributed to any community members who needed to leave the safety of the farm for any reason. But for the time being, They asked that all residents remain safely within the farm's boundaries. Tripwires were set up around the exterior of the wall as well, some of them connected to explosives that would warn the farm's sentries when something was approaching. The wall sentries were also given an old ram's horn that Joe had bought from a Lord of the Rings convention years ago. Sam had, of course, rolled his eyes at the purchase at the time, but when blown into, it made a loud noise that could serve to warn the residents of approaching danger. Joe had created a system for the horn, where the guard would blow into it one time if members of the community were approaching on return, twice in the event of an unknown stranger or strangers coming near the wall, and 3 times in the event of an emergency. Dr. Jeffries had given Jerry a clean bill of health. The young man would need to take it easy for a while, but the antibiotics and supplies recovered from the abandoned pharmacy had not only ensured his recovery, but provided a surplus of medications that would be used to treat the members of the farm community for a long time to come. But despite all of these preparations and good omens, Sam's heart was still heavy with worry. The death of Jacob still hung over him like a specter of guilt, pushing down on him from all sides as he tried to put one foot in front of the other and continue on. He found himself journeying to the wall several times a day, just to check on the sentries and ensure they had everything they needed. Of course, they were always fine, keeping their keen eyes locked on the land ahead, constantly scanning for any and all threats. But Sam feared for them, the same way he now feared for every member of the farm community. He would not have another Jacob on his conscience, not now and not ever. These people weren't trained. They weren't soldiers or police officers or fighters by any stretch of the imagination. They were just simple men and women trying to survive in a world that had become so alien and frightening. Sam had provided them a safe haven and had seen to it that they were fed and clothed and protected by strong walls. But there were dangers in this world beyond just Julio Roja, and the loss of Jacob had made Sam double down on his promise to protect everyone under his care from anything that might seek to do them harm. It was nearly 3 p.m. when Sam set out to the wall for the 4th time that day. Nervous energy was making it hard to stay in one spot for too long, and he had to keep moving, or his mind would dwell on the horrors that lay out there in the world. This time, as he trekked across the fields on foot, he found Joe emerging from the direction of his house, trudging along in the direction of the wall as well. Sam waved over to him, and Joe altered his course to intercept his friend. "Are you heading for the wall too?" Sam asked, wondering if Joe was feeling as uneasy as he had been. "Guilty as charged," Joe replied, rubbing at the back of his neck in embarrassment. "Though I hear you've become quite the feature attraction over there the last few days." "Oh yeah, I like to check to make sure they have everything they need," Sam admitted with a shrug, as they stopped together in the middle of the field. "And how many times have you been over there today?" Joe asked, crossing his arms over his chest, with a questioning raised eyebrow. Sam swallowed hard and felt his face flush with redness. "This would be the 4th, he said, not wanting to lie to Joe just to save face. "And you think sometime between the other 3 check-ins you've done that now the sentries miraculously have run out of supplies or faced some kind of horrible danger?" he asked skeptically. "Hey, you're heading over there too," Sam pointed out. "For the first time today," Joe corrected him. "I think as head of security for the farm, I'm entitled to at least that." "All right, fine," Sam said, conceding Joe's point. "I guess I'm feeling nervous is all." "I get it. You're fine," Joe said. "If you weren't nervous, I'd think you were a moron." "Well, I'm glad I'm not a moron," Sam said dryly. "I didn't say that," Joe quickly said. "I just said you weren't a moron because of this." Sam wasn't about to bite back on Joe's comment when the sound of the ram's horn filled the air. Both of them stopped and looked in the direction of the gate. It had only sounded one time. Was it possible that someone had managed to survive out there and was returning? Was it Jacob? Could it possibly be? A second blast of the horn quickly dashed those hopes. Was a stranger approaching, looking for aid? He wasn't certain they had any aid to provide anyone they didn't implicitly trust, already in the wake of dangers they were already facing. A third blast of the horn sounded, and Sam's stomach dropped in absolute horror. An emergency. Were they under attack? Sam looked over at Joe. His dread echoed in the normally unreadable face of his best friend. The two of them took off running toward the gate, and they weren't the only ones. Able-bodied men and women from all over the farm responded to the sound of the horn, armed with guns, knives, and pitchforks. Sam was shocked at how quickly they'd all mobilized against this potential danger. Of course, they'd worked out what to do in the event of an emergency, and they were all doing exactly what was discussed. But Sam was impressed with the response time and the willingness to run into danger. As the wall drew even closer, Sam could see the sentries with their weapons drawn, all pointed outside the gate. One of them turned at Sam's approach and waved for him to join them up on the ramparts. Sam climbed the small ladder leading to the top of the wall, followed by Joe. The top of the wall was marked by spiked wood, which gave it a prickly, medieval appearance. This was done to keep enemies from trying to climb over, and Sam was confident it would be effective in fulfilling that purpose. As he rose to his full height at the top of the ladder, he could see 5 sentries stationed atop the gate. All looked worried, their guns shaking as they pointed at some unseen foe. "They're asking for you," one of the sentries called back to him. Sam walked up to the spikes on the top of the wall and looked over the landscape. What he saw there nearly sapped the life from his body. "Fuck," Joe responded, his voice tight. Spread out before, stretched out into the distance, was a massive army with hundreds of people that might have even stretched over 1,000. They were all armed, all still, and all staring at the wall as though it were no more than a child's block tower that could be easily knocked over. But at the front of that company was the one sight Sam had been dreading most of all. Julio Roja stood unmoving at the head of this massive cartel force, his single eye locked on the wall and focusing intently on Sam the moment he came into view. Sam tried to keep the look of shock from his face, but he was certain he would fail in this regard. Not only was Roja here, right outside the farm, but he was backed by an enemy force beyond massive. It was an army, a horde, an invasion force so huge that it could easily overwhelm their defenses. They were nothing when stacked up against this threat, and the confident smile that suddenly spread over Julio's face showed he knew it. They were staying away from the wall thus far, and none had drawn close enough to trigger any of the landmines Sam had planted. But even those explosives wouldn't be enough to stop an army of this size. "Long time no see, pendejo," Julio called out, spreading his arms wide, as if offering Sam a hug. "I hope you miss me, because I've missed you." Sam fell silent as he looked out over this massive army, his face pale, as he glanced over at Joe, who seemed equally dumbfounded. He peered back at the assembled farmhands and residents of the community, who had arrived with their meager weapons in hand. There were maybe 100 of them. He noticed that Carolyn and Eric were among them, right at the front of the company. Eric was looking up at him with a grim expression, and Sam knew the way he responded to this threat would be felt by every single person down there. "Brother," Joe said beside him, "be strong, show no fear." Sam noted that Joe's expression had shifted to stoic and severe, his posture straight and strong. He would have to mirror that if he were going to have any hope of stopping this onslaught from occurring. Sam straightened up, swallowing the fear rising within him and giving Roja the most severe and intense look he could muster. A look that seemed to say he felt no fear in the face of impending doom. "Get off my land," Sam said. his voice washing down from his position on high and carrying over the enemy force. Roja laughed, though it never caught on to the massive army at his back. They remained silent and imposing. "Your land," Roja said, stomping his foot down on the dirt. Sam wished he was doing that a few hundred yards closer, preferably on one of the many landmines he'd implanted. "You think this is still your land? Maybe it was for a time, but I'm looking at my newest property, the new centerpiece for the entire cartel operation." "Like hell," Sam spat back, trying to stop his frantic mind from imagining his farm becoming the heart of a criminal empire. He'd never let that happen. If he had to fight to his very last breath, he would stop that from happening. "I think it's what I'm owed, amigo," Rojas said. "After all, you and your family have taken from me. I mean, you took my eye, and then your little crotch spawn took from me the only family I ever had. I think taking your farm is only fair compensation." "You're never stepping foot inside these gates," Sam shouted back down. "You're owed nothing and you'll get nothing. And if you try me, the only place you'll be going is to join your uncle in hell." Julio's face twisted in anger for a split second, and he looked as though he were about to take a step forward. But then he did the last thing Sam ever expected and composed himself. He took a deep breath, swallowed his rage, and let his confident, relaxed posture return. "Actually, you're right about one thing," Julio said. "This farm, that's not what I'm owed. I'm gonna take this farm, plus your head and the head of your son. Then I'm going to put them on spikes and mount them on that wall you're standing on as a reminder to anyone who ever thinks of fucking with my family and me ever again. There's a high cost." "You're never coming near this place or my family," Sam said, trying to sound confident. But he knew they stood no chance of turning the tide against such a force conventionally. Rojas seemed to know it too. "Ah, Sam," Julio said, wagging a finger up in his direction. "It's not good to lie. What kind of example are you setting for your murderous son? Eric, was it?" "You leave my son's name out of your fucking mouth," Sam spat, shocked that Julio actually knew the boy's name. "Shields, you've got to learn to let go, man," Julio mocked him, with a wicked smile from the ground. "Once they grow up and start killing innocent old men, then it's time to cut the cord." "You think your uncle was innocent?" Sam spat down at him, repulsed by his rhetoric. "He deserved a bullet more than anyone in that alley. I'm only sad I didn't do it myself." Julio fell quiet, and while it was mostly imperceptible, Sam imagined that he could see the entire cartel army take a minute step back and away from him, as if afraid he was going to spontaneously combust into a fiery inferno. Any and all humor and playfulness vanished from Rojas' face, and he silently stared up at Sam, the two men connected by invisible lines of hatred that coursed between them. If looks could kill, both Sam and Julio would have been struck dead instantly, in the most violent and painful manner possible. "Here's how it's going to go," Julio said. "Your farm is mine. Your house is mine. Your son is mine. Your fucking life is mine to do whatever I want with. As of this moment, all of that is true. But I'm going to be merciful and give you 48 hours to put your affairs in order. Your people can take the time to leave. I have no quarrel with them. But they should all consider this their eviction notice. At the end of 2 days, we're coming back. We're going to break down this wall. We're going to take you and your son, and then not even God himself will be able to save you. Anyone still remaining on my property on that day will be killed along with you. If you and your spawn try to run, I'll cut a bloody swath through this entire area, killing every civilian I see until the two of you are laid out in front of me." Sam tried to respond, tried to come up with something, anything he could say in the face of this threat. But he had nothing. It wasn't even a threat. It was a declaration of truth. It was a promise of death and destruction. 2 days, he repeated up to Sam. His words carried through the air, surrounded by all the scorching hatred he could muster. At sundown, on the 2nd day, anyone left on this farm is fair game. Roja turned without waiting for a response. At his movement, the entire company shifted, starting to march away without so much as a glance back in the direction of the farm. Sam watched them with wide eyes as beads of sweat started to form on his temple, despite the cool breeze wafting across the land. They were so in sync. This wasn't a disjointed collection of criminals. This was an organized military force, aligned behind a leader they both feared and believed in. Sam watched the armed men recede like a wave on the beach, retreating back into the sea. But much like a wave, Sam knew this wave would come crashing violently back onto the shore soon enough. He finally managed to pull his eyes away from the retreating horde, turning back hesitantly to look down at those who had gathered at the wall. They were all looking up at him, with anxious faces. Carolyn appeared pale, and Eric was actually sitting on the ground next to his mother, as if he no longer had the strength to hold himself upright. Even more residents of the farm had arrived during the encounter with Roja, and every eye was trained on him. Every single one. Their fear was palpable, but there was still a glimmer of hope in their faces, and it broke Sam's heart to see. They trusted him. They had faith in him. They believed he was going to turn around with a plan and a hopeful speech and lead them to victory against an overwhelming enemy force. But this was no fairy tale. It wasn't one of Joe's fantasy adventure novels either. This was real life. They were 400 against an army of 1,000 plus, and of those 400, there were maybe 320 or so who were combat ready. The rest were too old, too young, too weak, or too sick to lend a hand on the field. But he had to say something. He couldn't just turn tail and run away, leaving them all to wonder behind him. Should he tell them to run? Ask them for help in stopping this invasion of their home? Sam honestly had no idea what he could or should do in this situation. He looked at Joe, who stood beside him. The big man laid a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it reassuringly. "We're with you," he said, low enough so that only Sam could hear him. "We're all with you." Sam paused and took a deep breath, holding it in his lungs as his brain tried to find words to push out along with the air. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a single syllable, he was interrupted by a voice from outside the wall. "No shields," the voice of Julio called out. Sam turned around to see the cartel leader had stopped and was marching back toward the gates with a large black duffel bag and 15 armed men flanking him. "I almost forgot. I got you a little going-away present." Julio flung the bag in the direction of the gate, and it stopped a good 20 feet from the doors. "I hope you enjoy it," he said, before turning back around and walking off with the rest of his men. "What the fuck is that?" Joe muttered, squinting in the light to try to see what was sitting there. "A bomb or something?" "It's nothing good," Sam replied, "but I don't think it's a bomb." They waited until the cartel forces had vanished over the horizon, and Sam ordered the gates opened. He and Joe climbed down the ladder and made their way outside, walking cautiously up to the bag. Joe kicked it with the toe of his boot and grimaced down at it. He nudged it once more. "It doesn't feel like a weapon, and I don't think we should stay out here," he said grimly. "Let's bring it inside," Sam said, reaching down to lift the bag as they walked together back through the gates to rejoin the community. As the massive doors were pulled closed and barred once more, Sam laid the bag on the ground, morbid curiosity overriding any and all common sense as he unzipped it. Instantly, The grotesque smell of rotting flesh rose from the bag's interior, and Sam gagged on the vile aroma. After a momentary recoil, he placed his hand inside the bag, his fingers closing on something that felt like human hair. He pulled his arm free and lifted from within the bag a human head, blood still pouring from the slice that cleaved it from its body. The face was frozen in a moment of terror, the eyes wide and mouth agape around a series of bruises and lacerations that dotted the pale dead flesh. It was a face Sam knew well. It was a face all of them knew well. It was Jacob's face. Jacob's head. A scream rose up from the crowd, and Sam's fingers sprang open, instantly dropping the head unceremoniously to the ground. The people gathered in front of him took off running in a panic, some screaming in fear, while others wailed in grief at the sight of their friend and neighbor's ultimate fate. "No," Sam said, taking a step back and bumping into Joe, who grabbed him by the shoulders from behind to keep him upright. "No, no, no," he said over and over again, until his throat was dry and sore. Tears flowed from his eyes as his gaze locked onto the wide-eyed horror etched on the dead face of his former friend and farmhand. He couldn't help but notice how Jacob's final expression so closely mirrored the look he wore the last time Sam had seen him, as he lay bleeding on the street of a dead town, arm outstretched and begging Sam to save him. Sam hadn't saved him, and Jacob clearly hadn't died on that street as they thought he had. By leaving Jacob there, Sam had failed not only the young man who had placed his trust in him, but the entire farm community that looked to him for leadership. His failure was now complete. Chapter 30. Joe practically had to carry Sam into the house hours later. The former NYPD captain was leaning on his friend for support, as though he hadn't the strength to remain upright on his own. That weakness had nothing to do with his injured leg. It had nothing to do with any physical ailment. Sam's spirit was broken. His survival instincts and his will to carry on were empty. He was a dead man. His son was a dead man. Anyone who remained behind to fight at his side and protect this place was going to die in horrific ways, through torment cooked up by the most depraved sociopath Sam had ever encountered. "This is impossible," Sam said in shock, as Joe maneuvered him into the kitchen and helped him into a chair at the table. Sam's head nearly fell and struck the wooden surface, but he managed to catch himself with both hands, his fingers digging into his hair and scalp. "We can't. It's impossible." "No, it's possible," Joe said. "It's real, it's here, and it has to be dealt with." "Dealt with?" Sam exclaimed, lifting his chin to look up at his friend in shock. "Dealt with how?" "In the field," Joe responded, making a strong fist and pumping it toward Sam, as though trying to infuse his broken friend with strength. "You saw the size of that army," Sam said, shaking his head in disbelief. "How are we supposed to hold that off?" "We can do it," Joe said. "We can stop him and put him in the dirt once and for all." "Again, Joseph," Sam said. "You saw the size of that army. What are we supposed to do against something like that? What can we possibly do? We're beyond outnumbered and outgunned." "Outnumbered?" Joe said, tapping his chin, as if actually trying to dispute this undeniable fact. "Sure, but outgunned?" He pointed toward the kitchen door and the back porch. "You and I both know the weapons you've got in that armory. The ones that survived in the Faraday cage make his guns look like water pistols." Sam threw his hands in the air and let them slap down hard on the table. "Sure, we have some heavy weapons," Sam said, "but we don't have enough people to use them. So what are your suggestions here?" "He's suggesting we fight, Dad," Eric's voice sounded from the living room as he and Carolyn walked into the kitchen. He's saying let's bring the fight to this son of a bitch. Eric, Sam said, his voice slow and weary, as though the sheer act of this conversation were draining the last of his energy reserves. You didn't see how many of them there were. No, but I did, Joe responded, and I still think we have a shot here. How? Sam screamed, slamming his fist on the table and rising to his feet. You keep saying that, Joe, but fucking how? Don't talk to me about hope and confidence and any of that other bullshit. This isn't Lord of the Rings. It's real life. Yeah, but we have a wall, Eric said. And Sam looked over at him. His eyebrows were up, his eyes wide with excitement. His hands were balled into fists. And he looked at his father as though he'd just unraveled the secrets of the universe. And we have a whole 2 days to prepare. Exactly, Joe said. Let them break themselves on the wall. Let them blow themselves up in a minefield while we pick them off one at a time. That's only going to stop so many of them, Sam responded with exhaustion. What do we do when they break through and tear down the gate? Then we pick them off as they bottleneck their way inside through one entrance, Eric said, continuing Joe's thought. And when they spread out around us, Sam asked, falling back into his seat at the table. What then? Then we fight, Carolyn said, joining the conversation and looking down at her husband with a fire in her eyes Sam had never seen before. We fight with everything we have, with every last ounce of determination in our bodies. We fight and fight until we're dead or they are. Who is we here? Sam asked, shaking his head and gesturing around the kitchen. The 4 of us? Dad, Eric said, laying his hand on Sam's forearm. There's something you need to see. What? Sam said, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Come here, Eric said, pulling on his arm in the same way he had as a child, when trying to get his father to come play a game with him out in the yard. Sam sighed and stood, though it took almost all his energy to rise. Eric pulled him out into the living room, heading toward the front door. Joe and Carolyn were following close behind as Eric flung open the front door. Sam looked beyond the porch and saw nearly the entire community gathered in front of him. He blinked in shock. He was certain that most of them would have fled the homestead by now, packing up their things and heading for the hills. Word of Roja and his ultimatum had no doubt spread through the community like wildfire. And every single person standing in front of his house right now understood if they were still here in 2 days' time, they were all but sacrificing their lives to a madman. What the hell? Sam asked, stepping out onto the front porch and gazing out at a united community who stood tall with their heads held high. There was no hesitation in their posture, and there was no panic or stress permeating off their bodies. Instead, they stood as one, like a true community would, like a true family would. Dad, Eric said, walking out in front of his father and down the steps to stand in front of the people, looking up from the head of the massive company with strength and determination. We all know the risks. Everyone knows what happened. And if our home is under attack, if you're under attack, then we're all with you until the end of the line. Sam looked out over the crowd again, wondering if his son was truly speaking for all these people. No one seemed shocked at his words. No one was shaking their head or backing away. They'd heard Eric's declaration of support and stood in support of every word he said. Carolyn pushed past Sam to stand next to their son. We believe in you, Sam, she said, putting a hand on Eric's shoulder. All of us do. And we've all worked hard to turn this place into our home. We all work side by side every day to ensure our children and our children's children will share this dream. This is our land. Not just yours and mine, but all of ours. And we're not going to just leave you and Eric to be gunned down by these maniacs. You wouldn't just give up. If it was anyone out here in the same situation, why would any of us give up on you? Joe then moved past Sam, walking down the steps to stand on the other side of Carolyn and look up at Sam with that same determined fire. "You're stuck with us, brother," he said with a half-smile. "All of us. We're all gonna stand with you and send this asshole to hell with a one-way ticket. Am I right?" Joe called back over his shoulder at the people of the farm community. And they all cheered as one, pumping their arms in the air and screaming as though they were at a concert and not standing in solidarity to fight for their lives against an overwhelming enemy force. Sam felt tears sting his eyes once more, looking out over this group of individuals. They weren't all alike. They had different dreams and priorities. They came from all walks of life. They represented different religious beliefs, political opinions, and worldviews. But they were here together, standing in support of him, in support of this place and all who called it home. Sam reached up and wiped a tear from his eye. He took a moment to gently sniffle and collect his thoughts. Staring out over the crowd, he made a promise to himself that he wouldn't give up. He couldn't give up. He wanted to repay the kindness and the loyalty these people showed him, over and over again. He wanted to assure them that their faith was not misplaced. So he would fight with them. He would stand with them. And win, lose, or draw, by the end of this ordeal, they would finish this knowing that they gave it their all. "All right," Sam said softly. Then he repeated it loudly, raising his voice to be heard over the screaming of the crowd. "All right, I hear you, and I won't abandon you. We're in this together, and we're going to fight together for better or worse. Let's give these fuckers hell." The screams of the community joined together into a cacophonous exclamation of support. It was time to get to work. Chapter 31. Eric was amazed at how quickly his father set to the task of fortifying the farm's defenses. Much had already been done prior to Julio's arrival and subsequent threat, but his father and Uncle Joe clearly had a lot of additional ideas to implement, and were hard at work ensuring that when the cartel arrived to take its revenge, the farm would be more than ready. The words of the drug lord still rang in Eric's ear, even 12 hours removed from the incident. It called him a murderer, which even Eric had to admit was almost humorous, coming from Manhattan's most infamous cartel crime boss. Julio Roja was a stone-cold killer. His father and uncle had done much to convince Eric that Don Eduardo, the man he'd killed, was no better than his nephew, and in many ways had been far more dangerous. Those words had been little more than that to Eric, up until Julio Roja had arrived at their doorstep. Eric had some limited exposure to the cartel boss during their escape from the city, but listening to him rant and threaten to kill 400 people as though it were nothing at all had done a lot to ease his addled conscience. He wasn't the bad guy here. Roja and his ilk were the criminals, the true murderers, the monsters who had to be stopped, lest they destroy everything his family had worked so hard to create. Since the threat of the cartel horde had fallen on the farm, Eric had stopped to consider exactly what this place was and what it represented, not just to him, but to all those who had chosen to stay behind and fight for it. The world, as far as he knew, had been decimated by the EMP. Society had collapsed, as horrible, unseen people had laid waste to what remained of the city he once called his second home. But from the ashes of that society came this place, rising from the muck to create a safe haven, a second chance for men, women, and children from all walks of life. Since returning from the ruins of Manhattan, he'd been too wrapped up in his own thoughts, his own guilt, to truly appreciate how special all of this was. He thought of the other people outside these walls, trying desperately to survive, being preyed upon by roaming gangs or opportunistic brutes looking to take what little they had. But this place represented a light at the end of the tunnel, a promise that human society could endure in the face of insurmountable hardship and rise up stronger than ever. This farm contained a group of people who proudly stated they would not turn tail and run from the world, that they wouldn't simply vanish into the night, losing out to despair as the struggle for survival overtook them. This group of people gathered together in the name of decency, kindness, and cooperation to prove that people could still be good, that there was a second chance for humanity, and that life would find a way no matter what disaster hit. That was worth fighting for. And while Eric knew he was also fighting for his own life and the life of his father, this wasn't the primary driving factor for the 100 of people who stayed, despite knowing they'd be spared a gruesome death if they just abandoned this dream. They were fighting all of this for the future. The future, he said aloud to himself, as he watched his father walking with a group of young men and women with shovels. Behind them came at least a dozen other residents, pushing large wheelbarrows filled with large wooden crates. Eric knew these contained landmines. His father had quite the collection of them sitting in the ammunition shed, and he'd also buried several outside the wall. But now he seemed intent on creating a massive minefield outside the wall in order to blow the invaders to hell and potentially halt their advance. It was a smart plan. As they approach, they'd set off the explosives, blowing themselves to kingdom come. This would ensure the oncoming army slowed its advance, fully aware at that point that they were walking into a trap. And while they slowed, their people on the wall would be able to pick them off with automatic rifles and other assorted heavy weapons. Eric had always known as a child that his father's personal barn was a place he was never allowed to venture alone. It wasn't until he was older that he realized why. He'd been amazed the first time his father had let him inside, showing him the various weapons that lined the walls. Knowing that his father had taken such precautions had given Eric a sense of security growing up, which he kept alive and well until the day New York was attacked, and he was forced to fend for himself. "Hey there, kiddo," the voice of his mother called out, and Eric turned to see her walking up toward him, clad in a pair of blue jeans and a flower print blouse. Her hair was done up with a long, floppy hat, concealing her face from the sun. She looked as though she'd been working in a garden or out in the fields. But Eric knew his mother had been hard at work helping with the preparations. "Hey, Ma," Eric said, flashing her a smile. He noticed she was armed. A belt holster was wrapped around her waist, in which sat her small handgun. It was the same weapon both of them had used when making their way through the city, the weapon he'd used to accidentally end the life of Don Eduardo Roja. The small weapon looked even smaller sitting in the holster, which had been created for a much larger gun. "Trenches are dug out," she said, wiping some dirt from her hands. "And your daddy seemed to be setting out the minefield." She looked at him expectantly. "What?" he asked. She sighed and looked at the ground, shaking her head. "Eric, are you helping?" she asked, looking around the farm at everyone coming together to get things moving and fortify the property. Eric said, scratching at the back of his head. He'd been so lost in his mind this morning that he'd done very little in terms of actually getting things ready for the inevitable attack. "Sorry. Baby, you gotta pull your weight like everyone else," she said to him, her face etched with worry alongside the grime of the field. "I know," he said, "and I plan on it." "When?" she asked, her hands on her hips. He could tell his mother was growing impatient. "Right now," he said with a sigh, feeling his cheeks flush with crimson embarrassment. "Well, I'll help Dad and Uncle Joe set the minefield." "They've got more than enough help for that," she said, "though I'm sure Rebecca could use some help fortifying the barns and securing the livestock." "That's a good idea," he said, turning to head in the direction of the horse stables. "Eric, Carolyn said, calling after him. He stopped and turned back to her. "Yeah, Ma?" he asked. "I'm setting up the evacuation plan for the non-combatants," she said. "And I'll be going along with them to protect them when the fighting starts." "That's good," Eric said. Not sure why his mother was stopping him now to tell him all of this. "You know," she said slowly, dragging out her words and beating around the bush, "I might need some help. There are over 70 people I'm going to be looking after." "What?" Eric asked, suddenly confused by what she was saying. Then he suddenly realized exactly what she was getting at. "Wait," he said. "You want me to go with you when the fighting starts to help you protect the non-combatants?" "Yeah," Carolyn said, seemingly relieved that Eric had come out and said it himself. "It's an important job, and you'd be making a difference. I'm sure all the fighters will feel a lot better knowing their loved ones are protected by someone with your skills." She reached out for him, trying to touch him on the arm. But at the first brush of her fingertips, Eric pulled back. "No," Eric said, taking several steps back and away from his mother. "No, that's not where I'm needed. These people are coming here for me specifically. I can't just run off and hide with you on the far end of the property while other people fight and die for me." "They're fighting for the farm," Carolyn corrected. "Not for you specifically." "Yeah," Eric said, nodding. "But if it weren't for me, Roja wouldn't have chased us out of here. I'm one of the main reasons we're under attack. I have to help out there with Dad and Uncle Joe." Carolyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and her jaw was clamped shut. It was clear she didn't like this and wanted Eric to have no part in the climactic battle to come. "Ma," he said, stepping back toward her and touching her on the upper arm. "I get that you're nervous about all of this and that you don't want me out there, but it's where I need to be. I'm not a kid anymore." "You're my kid," Carolyn said, choking on a sob that threatened to swallow the back half of her statement. "And if you live to be 100, that's never going to change. But I want to make sure you live to 100, no matter what. That's my job, and it always will be." "Ma," Eric said, looking into his mother's eyes with compassion. She had worked so hard to keep him safe and alive during their adventure through the city. She was still trying to protect him now, and he was grateful for that. "I know why you're trying to keep me out of the fight. I get it. And when we were in the city, if it weren't for you, I would have died 100 times over. But I can't keep hiding from danger forever. Eventually, I have to stand on my own." A tear spilled out of Carolyn's eye, cascading down her cheek until it dripped off her chin. She nodded in understanding, and Eric believed for a moment that he could feel some pride mixed in with the fear and worry pouring out of her. "You do what you have to do," Carolyn said. "Keep your daddy safe out there for me, all right? And you come back no matter what. That's not a request, young man. It's an order." "Yes, ma'am," Eric said. Chapter 32. Sam stood up on the wall, in the same place he had been the first time Roja had walked up with his horde of goons and threatened the lives of every man, woman, and child who dwelled within the safety of this community he had formed. Joe was standing off to his right, massive and imposing, crossing his arms over his chest and glaring out at the setting sun, as if daring it to try to attack the farm itself. To his left, this time, stood Eric. His son was outfitted with body armor, a military-grade helmet, and a belt filled with weapons. He had access to handguns, small blades, and a submachine gun clutched in his hands. It was only a matter of minutes now, before Roja and his men would appear on the horizon, approaching the wall once more. But the wall that they had stood in front of 2 days ago was not the wall that loomed over the future battlefield now. Many improvements had been made over the last 2 days, including mounted machine guns, spikes along the exterior, and a massive minefield that was ready to chew up the cartel army one by one. "Nah, this cocksucker just needs to show up," Joe said, his eyes narrowing. "There's no way he shows up on time," Sam said, shaking his head. "It's a scare tactic. He wants us to think that maybe, just maybe, he isn't coming, and then he'll take that hope from us by showing up in force." "Bastard," Eric growled, his hands tightening on his weapon. "Big time," Joe echoed, rotating his neck until it popped. Sam looked to his left and right, beyond his son and best friend, to the 20 armed sentries who were mounting the wall with him. He then glanced behind, at the rows of armed warriors who crouched in defensive trenches, dug into the soft, fertile ground of the farm. There were hundreds of them, all armed and ready. The moment Roja and his men broke through the gates, they'd be ready to mow them down. There were also tripwires placed between the gate and the trenches, hooked up to explosives, to thin Roja's ranks even more. And if all of that failed, Sam still had a few tricks up his sleeve. This was the best shot they had, and Sam was still iffy about their chances of survival. A part of him worried that sheer numbers would override their preparations, dashing their hopes, and making a mockery of all that careful planning. But he was ready to make this stand. If it claimed his life, then so be it. But he would not give Roja the satisfaction of taking him down without a fight. "What if he shows up with something crazy?" Eric asked. His eyes trained on the horizon for the first sign of movement. Some master plan that counteracts all of this. Joe scoffed at the concept, turning his head to Eric with a confident smile. "This guy isn't a planner," he said. "He's a pusher. He thinks he's just gonna roll up in here and push his way inside and use those superior numbers to overrun us. Guys like that are so goddamn arrogant that they don't even stop to consider that something might happen that could shrug off his bravado and strength. He's expecting us to throw something at him, but he thinks it's not gonna matter." "It's gonna matter," Sam said, his voice unshakable, despite nerves starting to eat at his insides. He bent his knees slightly, stretching them out and testing to see how much his leg was going to be able to withstand. He was happy to see that despite some of the usual soreness, he wasn't feeling especially weak. Sam knew he wasn't going to be able to spend the entirety of the battle up here in this perch. He'd eventually have to abandon this post and wade into the fray directly. He wished he could have the gift of his youth back for just a few hours. His accumulated knowledge, coupled with the body he had 20 years ago, would make him nearly invincible out there. But that was the great injustice of experience. By the time you have enough of it, your body doesn't know how to use it properly anymore. He glanced over at his son. He was a powerhouse, so young and strong. He could run, jump, dodge, shoot, and fight well. Sam had made sure of that the last 6 months. But once the chaos of the battle started to unfold around them, he wondered how Eric was going to hold up. Would that tremendous physical prowess get overpowered by his ability to mentally grasp the horrors that he was sure to see before this night was done? Sam hoped so. He'd promised Carolyn he'd do everything he could to keep their boys safe. And he intended to keep that promise as long as he had blood flowing in his veins. But he also wouldn't be able to keep his mind solely trained on Eric out there. He needed to focus on the battle, focus on Roja, and take him off the board. Without the head, the rest of the snake would hopefully be disjointed and fall apart quickly. The weight of the task in front of him caused some pain to form behind Sam's eyes. He had to coordinate the assault, fight against the invaders, keep his son alive, and take down the most dangerous man he'd ever encountered, all while simultaneously keeping himself alive to see the next stage of the plan. "You ready?" Joe asked him. Sam wondered if he was truly ready for all of that, but one more glance around him at their preparations and the determined faces of these brave men and women answered the question for him. "Damn right I am," he said, as the sun vanished fully behind the horizon. "Now, these bastards just have to show up